The morning sun peeked through the white curtains of Harold Matthews' bedroom window, just as it had done for the past 50 years. At exactly 6 o'clock a.m., the 93-year-old veteran opened his eyes, a habit he had kept since his military days in World War II. His movements were slower now, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. Harold lived alone in his small but well-kept house on Cedar Street. The light blue paint was fresh, the grass was always cut, and the American flag hung proudly by the front door. Every morning, he followed the same routine that gave purpose to his days. First, he made his bed with military precision, corners tucked tight, blanket smooth enough to bounce a quarter off it. Then, he put on his pressed khaki pants and a clean white shirt. In the kitchen, Harold prepared his simple breakfast: 2 pieces of toast with butter, 1 boiled egg, and a glass of orange juice. He ate at the small round table by the window, where he could watch the neighborhood coming to life. Mrs. Thompson from next door would walk her small dog, Tommy, and wave at him. The Miller kids would rush to catch their school bus, their backpacks bouncing as they ran. After breakfast came Harold's favorite part of the day, tending to his rose garden. The garden wasn't just any garden. It was a living memory of his late wife, Margaret. They had planted the first roses together when they bought the house in 1973. Now, 40 different rose bushes filled the front yard with colors: red, pink, yellow, and white blooms that made passersby stop and stare. Harold worked carefully among the roses, his weathered hands gentle as he removed dead leaves and checked for insects. He used special pruning scissors that Margaret had given him on their 40th anniversary. Even though she had passed away 5 years ago, Harold still found himself talking to her as he worked. "Look at this new bloom, Maggie," he would say softly. "It's that deep red you always loved." By 9:30 a.m., Harold would clean up and prepare for his daily walk to Joe's Diner, 3 blocks away. He put on his favorite blue cap, not because of style, but because Margaret had always insisted he protect his head from the sun. The walk took him 15 minutes now, though it used to take only 8 when he was younger. Still, Harold never complained about his slower pace. Life's not a race anymore, he often thought. At Joe's Diner, everyone knew Harold. Sally, the waitress who had worked there for 20 years, would have his coffee ready before he even sat down at his usual booth by the window. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," she would say with a bright smile. "The usual today." The usual was a cup of black coffee and a slice of apple pie, served exactly how Margaret used to make it. While enjoying his coffee, Harold would read the morning newspaper, paying special attention to the local news and the crossword puzzle. Other regular customers would stop by his table to chat, asking about his roses or sharing stories about their families. Young parents would tell their children, "That's Mr. Matthews. He fought in World War II to protect our country." Harold would smile kindly at the children, sometimes sharing simple stories about his time in the service, careful to keep them appropriate for young years. After his time at the diner, Harold would walk back home, stopping to chat with neighbors working in their yards or checking their mail. He knew everyone on his street: the Johnsons with their new baby, old Mr. Peterson who still mowed his own lawn at 85, and the Garcia family who always invited him over for Sunday dinners. Life was quiet, but Harold liked it that way. His days had a comfortable rhythm that brought him peace. He had earned this peace, he felt, after serving his country and raising 3 children with Margaret. His kids called him every Sunday, and his grandchildren visited during holidays. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a good one, filled with small pleasures and dignity. Little did Harold know that this peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his patience, courage, and wisdom in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. The changes began on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Harold was trimming his rose bushes when he heard it: the loud rumble of motorcycle engines coming down Cedar Street. He looked up to see 3 large moving trucks following behind a group of motorcycles, all heading toward old Wilson's garage 2 blocks away. Wilson's garage had been empty for the past 2 years. The old auto repair shop, with its faded red brick walls and rusty sign, had been a neighborhood landmark for decades. Mr. Wilson had passed away, and his children hadn't been interested in running the business. Now, it seemed the empty building had new owners. That afternoon, the whole neighborhood watched as members of the Steel Thunder Motorcycle Club moved in. They painted over the old Wilson's Garage sign with their club logo, a black skull wearing a helmet with lightning bolts. The quiet afternoon air filled with the sound of hammers, power tools, and loud rock music. Mrs. Thompson, Harold's next-door neighbor, came over with her usual Wednesday coffee cake, her face filled with worry. "Did you see them, Harold?" she asked, standing in his kitchen. "All those motorcycles and those men with their leather jackets." Harold nodded calmly, though he shared her concern. He had seen plenty of tough characters in his time, but something about this group felt different. Within a week, the neighborhood's peaceful routine had completely changed. Instead of birds chirping in the morning, people woke up to the roar of motorcycles. The club members came and went at all hours, their bikes echoing through the streets. Children no longer played freely on the sidewalks, and elderly residents stopped taking their evening walks. Harold noticed how the walk to Joe's diner became different too. The route that took him past the garage now made him uncomfortable. Club members would gather outside, their motorcycles lined up along the curb. They would stare at him as he passed, some making comments under their breath. Harold kept his head high and continued walking, just as he had done under enemy fire in the Pacific. The situation at Joe's diner changed as well. The bikers started coming in for breakfast, taking up the larger tables and filling the quiet diner with loud conversations and rough laughter. Sally, the waitress, looked nervous serving them, though they paid their bills and left decent tips. Some regular customers stopped coming altogether. One morning, Harold overheard two club members at the diner talking about their plans to expand. "We'll need more parking space," one said. "Maybe we can convince some of these old-timers to sell their houses." The other laughed and added, "Yeah, shouldn't be too hard to persuade them." Harold gripped his coffee cup tighter but said nothing. The neighborhood association called an emergency meeting at the community center. Harold attended, sitting quietly in the back row as his neighbors voiced their complaints. Some wanted to call the police, others suggested writing to the city council. Mr. Peterson stood up shakily and said, "We can't let them take over our neighborhood." But no one seemed to know exactly what to do. The police came by a few times after receiving noise complaints, but nothing changed. The club members would quiet down temporarily, only to resume their loud activities the next day. They seemed to know exactly how far they could push without breaking any laws. Harold watched all this from his front porch, where he still sat every evening despite the noise. He thought about Margaret and wondered what she would say about all this. She had always told him to give people a chance, but she also believed in standing up for what was right. As the days passed, more for sale signs appeared in front yards along Cedar Street. The Garcia family, who had lived there for 20 years, was the first to move away. They couldn't handle the constant noise and feeling of unease. Others were thinking about following their example. Harold's peaceful life had been disrupted, but he wasn't ready to give up his home or his neighborhood. Each morning, as he tended his roses, he could feel the hostile stares from the bikers who passed by. But Harold Matthews hadn't survived a war and built a life here to be driven away so easily. Something would have to be done. He just didn't know what yet. The first direct confrontation happened on a warm Monday morning. Harold was making his usual walk to Joe's diner when three younger motorcycle club members stepped out of the garage. They were new faces, not the older members who usually just stared silently. These men were different, with hard eyes and mocking smiles. "Well, look who it is," the tallest one said, his voice carrying across the street. "Grandpa's taking his morning stroll." The others laughed, the sound sharp and unfriendly. Harold kept walking, his back straight, just as he had been taught in basic training 60 years ago. He could feel their eyes following him. As he passed the garage, one of them revved his motorcycle engine loudly, making Harold jump slightly. More laughter followed. "What's wrong, old-timer? Too loud for your hearing aid?" Another rev of the engine, closer this time. Harold's hands tightened around his walking cane, but he didn't change his pace or look their way. At Joe's diner, Sally noticed something was wrong as soon as Harold sat down. "Your hands are shaking, Mr. Matthews," she said quietly, pouring his coffee. "Are those boys bothering you again?" Harold tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing I can't handle, Sally," he replied, though they both knew things were getting worse. The next day, the same group was waiting. This time, they walked behind Harold, imitating his careful steps and laughing. "Look at me, I'm 100 years old," one mocked, hunching over and pretending to use a cane. Harold felt his face grow hot with anger and shame, but he remembered what his commanding officer had told him long ago: "Never let them see they've gotten to you." Mrs. Thompson watched the scene from her window, tears in her eyes. She wanted to help but was too scared to leave her house. Other neighbors peeked through their curtains, all of them feeling helpless and angry. The neighborhood that had once felt like a family now felt like a prison, with everyone trapped behind their doors. The harassment continued through the week. Each day, the young bikers found new ways to torment Harold. They would rev their engines as he passed, make jokes about World War II, and ask if he remembered dinosaurs. Some days they would ride their motorcycles slowly beside him as he walked, the engines growling like angry beasts. Harold started taking longer routes to avoid the garage. They seemed to be everywhere now. The club had grown, with more motorcycles filling the street and more members lambing around at all hours. The police had stopped responding to calls. They said unless there was actual violence, there was nothing they could do. One morning, Harold found a crude drawing taped to his mailbox. It showed an old man with a walker, with mocking words written beneath it. He took it down before any neighbors could see it, his hands trembling not with fear, but with a deep, burning anger he hadn't felt since the war. At the diner, things weren't much better. The younger club members would come in when Harold was there, sitting near him and making loud comments. "Maybe we should buy the diner too," they would say. "Turn it into a proper biker bar." Sally tried to protect Harold, but she was scared too. More and more regular customers stopped coming. The final straw came when Harold overheard them planning something bigger. "That old man's house would make a perfect parking lot," one said. "Just need to convince him to move." Another added with a sneer, "Yeah, maybe it's time to step up our game." That night, Harold sat in his living room, looking at old photographs. There was one of him in his uniform, standing proud and tall. Another showed him with his unit in the Pacific, their faces serious but determined. A third photo was of him and Margaret on their wedding day, both of them smiling and full of hope for the future. He thought about what Margaret would say if she could see him now. She had always told him that running from bullies only makes them bolder. "You didn't survive the war to live in fear," she would have said. Harold knew she was right, but he also knew that confronting these men could be dangerous. As he went to bed that night, Harold didn't know that the next day would bring a challenge that would force him to make a decision, one that would change everything in ways no one could have predicted. Harold woke up earlier than usual that morning, just as the sun was beginning to paint the sky pink. Something felt different, wrong. He put on his robe and walked to the kitchen window, where he always checked on his roses first thing. What he saw made his heart stop. His rose garden, Margaret's roses, lay in ruins. Deep tire tracks cut through the carefully tended beds, crushing the delicate plants beneath them. Motorcycle tracks zigzagged through the garden, leaving broken stems and scattered petals in their wake. The special yellow rose bush that Margaret had planted on their 40th anniversary was completely destroyed. Harold's legs felt weak. He grabbed the kitchen counter to steady himself, his whole body shaking. Slowly, he made his way to the front door and walked out into the cool morning air. The damage was even worse up close. 50 years of loving care had been destroyed in one night of senseless cruelty. Kneeling beside the ruined garden, Harold picked up a broken rose stem. The thorns pricked his fingers, but he barely felt the pain. A drop of blood mixed with the morning dew on what remained of a white rose petal. This garden had been more than just flowers. It had been his connection to Margaret, his way of keeping her memory alive. Mrs. Thompson came running out of her house in her mourning robe when she saw Harold in the garden. "Oh, Harold," she cried, tears in her eyes. "Those monsters. We should call the police." But Harold knew the police wouldn't do anything. They hadn't so far. Other neighbors began to gather, talking in angry whispers. Mr. Peterson brought his camera to take pictures for evidence, though everyone knew nothing would come of it. The Garcia family, who hadn't moved away yet, offered to help clean up the mess, but Harold barely heard any of them. His mind was somewhere else, back in 1944, on a small island in the Pacific. He had been scared then too, faced with enemies who seemed more powerful. But his commanding officer, Captain Roberts, had taught him something important. Sometimes, son, the only way to stop a bully is to stand up and face them, even if you're afraid. Harold went back inside, leaving his concerned neighbors in the yard. He walked slowly to his bedroom, where an old military trunk sat in the corner. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't needed to. The key was still in his dresser drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief Margaret had embroidered for him. With slightly trembling hands, Harold unlocked the trunk. The hinges creaked as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was his dress uniform. He had worn it on his wedding day, at Margaret's funeral, and every Veterans Day until his knees got too bad for parades. As he lifted the uniform out, something metal clinked against the trunk's side. His medals. Harold picked them up one by one, the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and others. Each one told a story of courage, sacrifice, and duty. He had earned them not by being fearless, but by doing what needed to be done despite his fear. Beneath the medals, he found a photograph he had almost forgotten. It showed his whole unit, standing proud after a major battle. Most of those men were gone now, but Harold could still remember their faces, their voices, their courage. What would they think if they could see him now, hiding from a bunch of bullies? Harold looked at his reflection in the bedroom mirror. He was old now, yes. His hair was white, his face lined with wrinkles, his shoulders slightly stooped. But inside, he was still the same man who had fought for what was right, who had protected others when they couldn't protect themselves. Making his decision, Harold began to carefully remove the uniform from its tissue paper wrapping. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. The bikers had crossed a line by destroying Margaret's roses. They had probably expected him to be scared, to finally give up and move away. Instead, they had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for a long time. As he laid out his uniform on the bed, Harold remembered something else Captain Roberts used to say. The most important fights are the ones you pick carefully, but once you decide to fight, you give it everything you've got. Today, Harold Matthews was going to fight. It took Harold exactly 20 minutes to put on his uniform, just as it had in the service. Every button was polished, every medal perfectly straight. His white gloves, kept clean in plastic for years, still fit perfectly. When he looked in the mirror, he stood straighter, his shoulders squared despite his age. The uniform still fit, though a bit looser now than in his younger days. Mrs. Thompson watched through her window as Harold walked out his front door in full military dress. She gasped, dropping her coffee cup. Other neighbors came to their windows too, drawn by the unusual sight. Harold Matthews, the quiet old man who tended roses, had transformed into something else entirely, a warrior from another time. Harold walked slowly but purposefully down Cedar Street. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked steadily on the sidewalk. The morning sun caught his medals, making them flash like signals. Each step was measured, deliberate. He was walking into battle, just as he had done so many years ago. The sound of motorcycles and loud music grew stronger as he approached the garage. It was Thursday, which meant the club would be having their weekly gathering. Harold could see at least 30 bikes parked outside, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight. The younger members who had been harassing him were lounging near the entrance, beer cans in their hands despite the early hour. One of them noticed Harold first. "Hey, look who's... Wait, what?" The laughter died in his throat as Harold came closer. Other bikers turned to look, conversations stopping mid-sentence. The music seemed to fade into the background as Harold approached the center of their gathering. Some of the bikers straightened up instinctively at the sight of the uniform. Others nudged each other, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Harold didn't say a word as he walked through their midst. His eyes were fixed on the clubhouse door, where the club's leader usually stayed. A path seemed to open before him as he walked. These men, who had seemed so threatening before, moved aside as he passed. Perhaps it was the uniform, or the medals, or the way Harold carried himself, as if he were surrounded by his whole unit, every man he'd ever served with walking beside him. The club leader, a big man with a gray beard and a leather vest covered in patches, appeared in the doorway. He started to say something tough, but then his eyes fell on Harold's silver star. His expression changed, the hard lines in his face softening into something like recognition. Harold stopped 3 feet from the club leader, just far enough to look him in the eye without tilting his head back. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The entire gathering had gone silent now. Even the music had been turned off. Everyone was watching, waiting. One of the younger bikers, the one who had been leading the harassment, started to laugh. "What's this, a costume party?" But his laughter died quickly when both Harold and the club leader turned to look at him. There was something in their eyes that made him step back. Still without speaking, Harold reached up and adjusted his silver star medal slightly. The sun caught it just right, making it shine. The club leader's eyes stayed fixed on it, and his hand moved unconsciously to touch a patch on his vest. one that Harold recognized as a combat badge from a more recent war. The moment stretched out, heavy with meaning. Around them, dozens of bikers watched, some shifting uncomfortably, others standing perfectly still. The younger members who had destroyed Harold's garden were at the back of the crowd now, trying to become invisible. Harold had faced worse odds before. On an island in the Pacific, with enemy fire all around, he had learned that true courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Now, standing in his uniform before these men who had tried to intimidate him, Harold felt that same courage filling him up. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. Every word he was about to say would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone present. The bold move he had planned was about to unfold, and there would be no going back. Harold's voice carried across the silent gathering, strong and clear despite his age. December 1944, he began. I was with the 5th Marine Division in the Pacific. His eyes swept across the crowd, settling on the club leader. We were just boys then, most of us no older than some of your younger members here. The club leader's expression changed slightly, recognition flickering in his eyes. He stepped forward, his voice gruff but respectful. That silver star, he said, pointing to Harold's medal. Iwo Jima. Harold nodded slowly, and a murmur went through the crowd. Some of the older bikers straightened their backs, their faces showing newfound respect. We lost 17 men from my unit that day, Harold continued, his voice steady. Good men, young men, they died protecting each other, protecting our values, protecting what we believed in. He paused, looking directly at the younger bikers who had destroyed his garden. They died so that all of us could live in peace, with dignity and respect. The club leader moved closer, removing his leather vest. On his shirt underneath was pinned a combat badge. Afghanistan, 2005, he said quietly. Lost some good men there too. He extended his hand to Harold. Name's Mike Stevens, Sergeant First Class, retired. Harold shook his hand firmly, soldier to soldier. A change came over the gathering. The younger members who had been smirking earlier now looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. One of them removed his cap, holding it respectfully. The older bikers moved closer, forming a circle around Harold and Mike. Tell them about Iwo Jima, Mike said, his voice carrying authority. These boys need to hear it. Harold looked around at the faces watching him, seeing not enemies now but lost young men, not so different from those he'd served with so long ago. Harold spoke about the beach landing, about the black sand and the terror and the courage. He talked about young men who never came home, about letters he had to write to their families. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about brotherhood, about standing up for each other, about the real meaning of strength and honor. As he talked, Mike nodded occasionally, understanding in his eyes. Some of the older bikers shared looks, remembering their own service or family members who had served. Even the younger members stood silent, many of them hearing first-hand accounts of World War II for the first time in their lives. Then Harold's voice changed slightly, becoming more personal. That garden you destroyed, he said, looking at the guilty members, my wife Margaret and I planted it together. Every rose bush has a memory. The yellow ones were from our 40th anniversary. The white ones, she planted when our first grandchild was born. Mike's face darkened at this revelation. You destroyed a veteran's memorial garden? He asked sharply, turning to the younger members. They looked at the ground, shame finally reaching their faces. One of them, the tallest one who had led the harassment, stepped forward. We didn't know, sir, he stammered, addressing Harold. About any of it. The garden, your service. His voice trailed off as Mike gave him a hard look. Harold could see the young man's tough facade crumbling, revealing someone much younger and less sure of himself. Mike put his hand on Harold's shoulder, a gesture of respect between soldiers. Mr. Matthews, he said, his voice carrying both authority and regret, I served to protect the same values you did. What these boys did, it goes against everything we fought for. He turned to face his club members, and it stops today. The silence that followed was different from the fearful quiet of recent weeks. It was a silence of understanding, of respect, of shame, and of possibility. Harold stood among them, his medals gleaming in the sunlight, no longer just the old man they had tormented, but a living piece of history, a reminder of sacrifice and honor. As the morning sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the garage yard, something profound was changing. The wall between them, age, culture, understanding, was beginning to crumble brick by brick, word by word. What would rise in its place would surprise them all. The change began that very afternoon. Mike gathered his entire club together, his face stern as he addressed them. "What happened here," he said, looking at each member in turn, "isn't what we stand for. We're going to make this right." The younger members who had destroyed Harold's garden stood in front, heads bowed in shame. To everyone's surprise, Mike shared something personal. "I got PTSD from my time overseas," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's why I started writing. The sound of the engine drowns out the memories sometimes." Several older members nodded in understanding. But that's no excuse for letting this club become something that dishonors what men like Mr. Matthews fought for. The tall young man who had led the harassment stepped forward. His name was Jason, and without his usual swagger, he looked much younger. "Sir," he said to Harold, "my grandfather served in Vietnam. He would be ashamed of what I did to your garden." His voice cracked slightly. "I want to make it right." Harold looked at the young man, seeing not the bully of recent weeks but someone's grandson, someone who had lost his way but might find it again. "Then let's make it right together," Harold said quietly. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Mike took charge immediately. "First thing tomorrow, we're rebuilding Mr. Matthews' garden. I want every able body here at sunrise." He turned to Harold. "If you'll let us, sir, we'd like to make it even better than before." Harold nodded, touched by the sincerity in Mike's voice. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The next morning, as the sun rose over Cedar Street, an extraordinary sight greeted the residents. Dozens of bikers, still in their leather jackets but now wearing work gloves, arrived with trucks full of new rose bushes, soil, and gardening tools. Mrs. Thompson watched in amazement from her porch as the same men who had terrorized the neighborhood now worked carefully in Harold's yard. She brought out coffee and homemade muffins, her hands shaking slightly as she offered them to the bikers. They thanked her politely, some even sharing stories about their own grandmother's baking. Harold walked among them, giving instructions about where each rose bush should go. He told stories about each variety, about what they meant to him and Margaret. The bikers listened respectfully, treating each plant with unexpected gentleness. Jason stayed closest to Harold, eager to learn and make amends. Mike worked alongside his men, sweat soaking his shirt as they prepared the soil. "My wife loves gardens," he told Harold during a break. Maybe she could visit sometime, learn from you about roses." The invitation to connection was clear in his voice. Harold smiled and nodded, remembering how Margaret had always said gardens bring people together. As the day went on, other neighbors began to emerge from their houses. The Garcia family brought homemade tacos for everyone. Mr. Peterson, who had been thinking of moving away, came with his grandson to help. The barrier between the bikers and the neighborhood began to dissolve, replaced by shared work and growing understanding. The transformation wasn't just in the garden. The club members who had been the most troublesome now worked the hardest to make things right. They listened to Harold's war stories with genuine interest, asking questions about his service and the men he'd served with. Some shared stories about their own family members who had served. By late afternoon, the garden had been completely rebuilt, but something else had been built too, a bridge between generations, between different ways of life. The bikers had discovered a kind of respect they had forgotten, and the neighbors had found courage they didn't know they had. Mike stood back, looking at the finished garden with satisfaction. "From now on," he announced to his club, "this garden is under our protection. Anyone who messes with it answers to all of us." The other bikers nodded firmly, their faces showing new purpose and pride. Harold looked at his restored garden, now even more beautiful than before. Each rose bush stood straight and strong, a symbol of something that had been broken but made whole again. Like the garden, the neighborhood had been transformed, not back to what it was, but into something new and perhaps even better. 6 months had passed since the day Harold confronted the motorcycle club in his uniform. Cedar Street had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The old Wilson's garage, once a source of fear for the neighborhood, had become something entirely different. The bikers still gathered there, but now their meetings had a new purpose. Mike had transformed the club into a veterans support group. helping younger veterans adjust to civilian life. The loud music still played sometimes, but more often you'd hear the sound of men talking, sharing their stories, helping each other heal. Harold's Garden became the heart of this transformation. Every Saturday morning, club members would come by to help tend the roses. Jason, once the leader of the harassment, had become Harold's most dedicated student. He learned the name of every rose variety and the story behind each one. His own grandfather, the Vietnam veteran, had come to visit after hearing about the changes in his grandson. "You did what I couldn't," the older veteran had told Harold, tears in his eyes. "You reached him." Now Jason helped organize the club's community service projects, starting with helping other elderly neighbors with their yards and home repairs. The neighborhood itself had bloomed like Harold's roses. The for sale signs disappeared one by one as people decided to stay. The Garcia family, who had been planning to move, instead opened their home every Sunday for community dinners. Bikers and neighbors sat together at long tables in their backyard, sharing food and stories. Mrs. Thompson no longer watched through her windows in fear. She became famous among the bikers for her coffee cake, which she brought to their meetings. Some of the younger members started calling her Grandma Thompson, and she found herself with more surrogate grandchildren than she knew what to do with. The biggest change came when Mike suggested something special for Veterans Day. "We want to honor you properly, Mr. Matthews," he said to Harold one morning. "You and every other veteran in the neighborhood." Harold agreed, touched by the sincerity in Mike's voice. On Veterans Day morning, the sound of motorcycles filled Cedar Street once again, but this time it was different. 50 bikes lined up in formation, their chrome polished to mirror shine. The riders wore clean leather vests with new patches. The club's logo now incorporated a rose and a military medal. Harold came out of his house in his dress uniform, which he now wore with even more pride. Mike and his club members saluted smartly as Harold walked to the lead bike. Behind him, other veterans from the neighborhood joined the formation, including Mr. Peterson and Jason's grandfather. The club escorted them to the Veterans Day parade downtown, their bikes forming an honor guard. People lined the streets, clapping and cheering as the unlikely group passed by. Harold sat straight and proud on Mike's bike, his medals gleaming in the sun. The roses in his lapel came from his own garden, now tended by many hands. At the ceremony afterward, Mike spoke about how meeting Harold had changed their club. "Sometimes the greatest courage," he said, "is reaching out to understand someone you thought was your enemy." The crowd nodded, many wiping away tears. The story of the 93-year-old veteran and the motorcycle club spread beyond their neighborhood. Other bike clubs started similar programs, reaching out to veterans in their communities. Harold's Garden became a regular stop for bikers from across the state, each leaving with a new understanding of respect and honor. As winter approached, Harold sat on his porch one evening, looking at his garden. The roses were preparing for their winter sleep, but the garden remained beautiful. Mike sat with him, both men comfortable in the quiet friendship they had formed. "You know," Mike said softly, "when we first moved in, we thought we were so tough. But you showed us what real strength looks like." Harold smiled, watching Jason teaching some newer club members about winter rose care. "Sometimes," Harold replied, "the bravest thing isn't fighting your enemies. It's giving them the chance to become friends." He thought of Margaret, knowing she would have loved to see this, her roses bringing healing and hope to so many. The rumble of motorcycles in the distance no longer meant trouble. Instead, it was the sound of brotherhood, of understanding, of wounds healing and bridges being built. Harold's bold move hadn't just stopped the bullying. It had created something new and beautiful, like a rose blooming in unexpected soil.